will eventually get to a point where, you know, they're going to hopefully appropriate your ideas into what they're going to do in terms of a governance strategy. So being active during this time of the year is not only legal, but it's really important for you to do. So I really am excited to be presenting all of this for you today. As mentioned, while I am now currently practicing in this weird little niche of tax and election law, I actually am, my background comes from way back in the day, the 20th anniversary of Columbia Riverkeeper. This makes me feel incredibly old. I was a co-founder of this organization when I moved out fresh out of law school. I was one of those Pace Law School grads who worked on clean water issues with Hudson Riverkeeper, and then eventually said, hey, why not out here too? So I'm really proud that the legacy of that organization still exists. And if you ever want to talk about citizen suits and Clean Water Act enforcement actions, hey, I'm your guy too. I still retain some of that in my head as well. In any event, now I'm with Alliance for Justice, and Alliance for Justice is a coalition of about 120 plus organizations. And one half of what we do is all of this, trying to demystify and make the rules on election season activity, lobbying, any type of advocacy that you're doing, make a little bit more sense. And we're a resource for you down the line. So we'll talk more about that later on. So let's just get cracking on all of this. I want to start off by basically filling in this chart here, just so that you understand, especially around election season, it's important to understand the variety of different organizations that are involved out there. That you're going to be maybe in coalition with, you're going to be, they're going to be with you, they're going to be against you. It's just good to know what the rules are for all these various organizations. What I'm going to focus on today, of course, is 501c3 public charities. That's what most of your organizations are. My organization, Alliance for Justice, also a 501c3 public charity. LCV Education Fund, Potomac Riverkeeper, any of these types of organizations are groups that are great tax treatment because they're tax exempt organizations and they can offer tax deductibilities to their contributors. That, as it turns out, is the best tax treatment that nonprofits get. And as I've practiced in this area for the last couple of decades, I've noticed that the better your tax treatment, the more restrictions there are on your advocacy work. So that's true in terms of lobbying. You're allowed to do it. There's actually a pretty generous amount of work that you can do in lobbying. I hope and encourage you all to engage in it if it's part of the type of policy work that you're working in. That's not what we're going to talk about today, except for one little narrow area. But that's one area where you can do it. You're just limited in how much you can do. The other area, electoral activities. Now, as we will discuss, and as we heard Kate talk about at the top here, there's a ton of things that you can do, so long as they're strictly nonpartisan. The one thing you can't do, the line you cannot cross, is doing anything that even remotely smells like you're supporting or opposing a candidate for public office. We're going to spend a lot of time today really fleshing what this all means, fleshing this out, and talking much more in depth, rather than delving into the areas of things you can't do. I'd rather talk about the things you can do, because there's a lot of positive change that you can make during election season. I want to make sure that you know all the different things you can do. Organizations that are also active during election season in terms of the nonprofit world, 501c4s, C5s, C6s. By the way, if you never knew where these numbers come from, I'm here to tell you, the tax lawyers, we are inherently uncreative creatures. We can only name things after the sections of the Internal Revenue Code. That's where this all comes from, Section 501c3, Section 501c4, etc. C4s, social welfare organizations like Alliance for Justice Action Campaign, my sister organization, LCV, sister organization to LCV Education Fund. These are organizations that are engaged primarily in advocacy work. C5s are labor unions, C6s are trade associations, and believe it or not, yes, the National Football League is a nonprofit. It is a 501c6 trade association, I know. All right, tax treatment for them, tax exempt organizations just like C3s, but unlike C3s, you can't write off contributions when you give to a C4, C5, or a C6. So tax treatment not as good, so as a result, advocacy work you can do a little bit more of out of these organizations, and you can see it right here, lobbying activity. These organizations are all really best built for lobbying activity. They can do an unlimited amount. Indeed, there are some C4s that all they do is lobbying activity. They can, and so can C5s and C6s, also engage in a limited amount of partisan electoral activity. They can do all the nonpartisan activity that they want, and as a secondary activity, in other words, less than half of what they do, they can do things that support or oppose candidates for public office. This is the one area of frustration for a lot of C3s, because you see a lot of C4s especially engaged in a little more hard-hitting electoral work, that feel a little bit more policy than election related. The thing is that the IRS looks at a lot of that stuff as supporting or opposing candidates for office. Things like voter guides that give like percentages, you know, you're a 0% LCV person or you're a 100% LCV person. That's considered partisan in nature, and I'll describe why in a little bit. So it's frustrating as a C3 because you can't do that kind of stuff. That's got to be left for the C4s, C5s, and C6s. So we'll contrast that a little bit later. Last but not least, the mirror opposite of what our organizations are 527 organizations, political groups, PACs, candidates, political parties, organizations along those lines. LCD Victory Fund, Emily's List, these are political committees, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, other parties, all 527s. They're the mirror opposite. They're tax exempt, sure, but their sole activity is typically, their exempt purpose activity is supporting or opposing candidates for public office, which is the mirror opposite of C3s. So as you would also see, lobbying, they can't do it at all. It's really, really rare and generally taxable. You're not going to be playing around a lot with 527 organizations typically as a 501c3. So this is sort of the lay of the land, though. This gives you an idea of what the different types of nonprofits can and can't do. We're really going to be spending a lot of time on this one particular rule. That is that you should be active participants in election years, but you got to be mindful of this rule, of the fact that you can't do anything to support or oppose a candidate for public office. You should be active, though, and this next slide gives you an idea of all of the types of things that we're going to cover over the next hour or so. We're going to start off with ballot measures. We're going to talk about continuing your issue advocacy, even if it's critical of incumbents who are running for re-election. We'll talk a little bit about that line that you have to walk. We'll talk about candidate education, and Kate talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk about voter reg and get out the vote efforts. Seriously important type of thing for you to be involved in, especially now, especially with gestures broadly, all of this. Voter protection, voter education, and then what you can do as individuals, whether you're a board member, a staff member, an officer, whatever, what you can do on your own time around elections, separate and apart from your organization, because the rules are different for you as an individual. So we're going to start off with ballot measures. Now, most of you are in states that don't have ballot measures as big of a deal as states out west, but you may from time to time have situations where there is something that's hitting the ballot that's legislative in nature. It may tend to be more on the local level for you, often bond measures or things along those lines. So while this might not be as important for you as it was for me when I was out in Oregon and Washington with Columbia Riverkeeper, it's something to keep in mind. Stuff like this is outside of the concept of partisan electoral work. It's actually considered lobbying work. Why? It's because a ballot measure is considered legislative in nature. So everybody who's voting on it is actually considered part of a gigantic legislative body. It's a little weird to wrap your mind around it that way, but it fits the rules better when you think about it that way. So direct lobbying is basically talking, making some kind of communication to the public as the legislative body, expressing a view on that ballot measure. If you do all of those things, you have to count your work as direct lobbying activity. I'm not going to get into lobbying limits and things along those lines. We have a whole publication that can help you with all that called Seize the Initiative. Again, I'm not so sure that this is going to be as big of a deal compared to the other things for you, but it's worth covering just in case it is for some of your work. Lobbying, as I mentioned, is a limited activity if you're a C3. The meter starts running. In other words, you got to track how much you're spending on this the second the petitions go out for signatures, if it's a petition-driven situation like so many of these things are. So just wanted to make sure that this was covered, even though I'm not 100% sure that this is going to be as relevant for everybody compared to other organizations in different states. State laws, in addition to the tax law requirements, will have additional things like registration and reporting requirements. You may be in the weird situation that you have to register with your state election commission for work on these types of things as a ballot measure committee or even as a political committee, which for 501c3s is generally something you are like, wait, we can't do this, but this is okay. This is the one area of getting involved directly in elections and asking people to vote in a particular way that is okay for you to do as a C3. And I wanted to put it out at the top because it's very different in kind compared to the other stuff where you cannot do anything to support or oppose candidates for office. So let's talk about issue advocacy, because this is really the number one thing. Even if you don't do any of the other stuff, You're advocates on issues around clean water, and you want to continue to do that during an election year, no matter what. Do not cede the microphone, do not cede the voice of what you're doing for clean water to other organizations out there, because sometimes they're not going to necessarily have the same interests that you have as community leaders in all of this. So continue your issue advocacy. You can do it. You just got to be mindful of a few different rules here. Now, again, I'm a broken record here. 501c3s, you can't support or oppose candidates running for public office. You can, however, do issue advocacy so long as you don't cross that line. It gets a little tricky though, and I use this cartoon to let you into the conundrum of my life. Hey, this magic 8 ball just keeps saying, it depends. Oh, that's the special lawyer edition. Why do I put this cartoon up? Because this is my life, literally. Why? Because the rule of how you determine whether or not you've crossed this line, whether or not you're supporting or opposing candidates, is something we call the facts and circumstances analysis. This is what the IRS does. And it looks at all of the facts, everything, your communication, the candidate's communication, parties, your allies, your opponents, everything, the context of the timing of the communication relative to the election. What have you been doing before? Everything. And what it does is the IRS puts it all in a big bag, shakes it up and takes a look and decides whether or not you've gone over the line. There's not a lot of guidance in this area and very few what we call safe harbors. So I can't give you a lot of bright line definitive, hey, yeah, sure, no problem, this is okay. Or, yeah, that's definitely over the line. It's often kind of muddied in the middle. And as we'll talk about in a minute, then that's the type of thing where I can give you an idea of what your risk is, and then you have to assess the risk relative to how important the communication is for your organization. But before I get to that, let's talk about the different types of facts that the IRS takes a look at. Now, I call these good facts and bad facts. And the good column is basically things that suggest that what you're doing is nonpartisan in nature and therefore legal. Things that are on the bad facts column tend to be factors that the IRS would consider to be things that tend to be partisan in nature. It doesn't matter if you load up things on the good side and only have one on the bad side or flip it around. There's no formula to this. These are just factors that the IRS looks at, and these are where they tend to fall. So let me just go through them really quickly here, because I think it's helpful when we get into some of the examples that I'm going to cover. On the nonpartisan side of things, no references to candidates or elections in your issue advocacy. An external factor driving the timing of your communication. So in other words, is there a bill before the state legislature? Is there something that's going on at the county level? Or is there something that's going on at the regulatory level and that's triggering your communication on the issues? That tends to be a nonpartisan factor. Talking about a broad range of issues. This tends to be in some other areas that we're going to be covering in a little bit, especially voter guides that Kate talked about before. Broad ranges of issues compared to narrow ranges of issues, as we'll see on the bad facts side, that tends to look more nonpartisan for you. A history of similar worker communications, a track record of advocacy. If all of a sudden, let's say that you're in the middle of an election and you're a clean water organization that hasn't talked about clean water, okay? Strange hypothetical, but let's go with it for a second here. If all of a sudden there is a campaign going on and clean water is a major issue differentiating the two candidates, and you just parachute it in and say, hey, let's talk about clean water, that tends to go against you. But if you are a clean water organization that has been talking about this issue time and time again, and you've been critical of an incumbent or praising an incumbent, you're allowed to continue that volume of advocacy and that praise or criticism going into the election season. History of similar work helps you. Part of an ongoing series of communications helps you in a different way. The method that you use to communicate. If you are using a newsletter and you have a little advocacy corner of your online newsletter that you do every single month, that's an ongoing type of communication where if you're constantly updating that, that tends to be nonpartisan in nature. Contrast that with, let's say that you have a newsletter and you never talk about issue advocacy. You never talk about the policy stuff. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks before an election, you put out a special edition of your newsletter and all of a sudden it's all about issue advocacy on something that happens to be big in the election. That's going to tend to look more partisan in nature for the IRS. So let's go over to the other side, to the bad facts column. Referring to candidates as candidates, referring to elections as specifically in issue advocacy, that tends to be considered partisan in nature in the analysis by the IRS. If the timing of your communication is clearly motivated by an election, going to be considered more likely to be partisan by the IRS. Again, also with politically motivated targeting, swing voters, swing anything for C3s, not good. You're going to tend to be looked upon as doing things that are partisan in nature if you're doing that. Big one, comparing candidates to your preferred position. Candidate A is great on clean water. Candidate B is terrible. Just thought you'd want to know, voters. That tends to look more partisan in nature. Now that can get kind of tricky, and that's where the issue advocacy stuff, we have to be careful with our wordsmithing to make sure we avoid those types of things. But comparing candidates with each other relative to your position, almost always going to be problematic for 501c3 organizations. C4s, no problem. That's where they can be more aggressive, and C3s have to be a little bit more circumspect with how they go forth with it. Talking about wedge issues that really divide candidates, these high profile issues where there's a real divide and it's super high up in importance of the election, that in and of itself could be problematic. That could be looked upon as partisan in nature. Now, the one thing that you'll notice is not here is intent. The IRS doesn't care if you didn't mean it. The IRS only cares if these facts and circumstances exist. So intent is not a factor. Some communications will become riskier the closer they get to the election. Context matters. Where I said intent does not matter, context really does. And that's why where you are on a calendar can make the one type of communication, one type of issue advocacy be absolutely no problem, and you move it closer to the election and all of a sudden we're in red light territory. So that's the type of thing that you want to be thinking about when it comes to your issue advocacy around election season. Some guidelines for you to think about. You want to focus more on the issues themselves than criticizing or supporting people that are running. As you get closer to the election in particular, you want to start removing, identifying, and pointing to people who happen to be running for office. Particularly, you do not want to name that they are running for office. Talk about the issues and find other ways to prioritize how you're communicating that. And I've got some examples coming up in a minute that'll show that. Avoid talking about issues in a way that talks about candidate qualifications. In other words, if you say something like, this candidate's position on clean water is disqualifying for them. Well, that's the type of thing that actually the IRS is really looking for and really doesn't like in a lot of the guidance that we have. So candidate qualification talk, keep that out of your communications. Try not to talk about voters or the election in your issue advocacy. Now, when we're talking about voter registration, get out the vote, things along those lines, then you're going to be talking, of course, about elections and voters. But in your issue advocacy, kick that language out because you don't want that to be part of your the analysis here. Because when you start to marry issue advocacy with the election, that's when that combination of things can become, well, problematic for C3s. You could do these things separately, but together they can become a bit of nitroglycerin. The closer we get to an election, you really want to start avoiding identifying candidates by name or image. And there are some tricks that you can do to avoid that and still be talking about the issues in a good C3 positive way. Last but not least, every once in a while, when you find yourself, you're close to the line on something and you feel like, as we'll talk about how I do the analysis here, we're in yellow light territory, something that's of some degree of risk, but you might be able to ameliorate that a little bit by having some kind of a disclaimer as a part of that communication that says, hey, by the way, we're a C3 organization. We don't support or oppose candidates for public office. Doesn't always work. It isn't a panacea. You can't just say, we endorse X. Oh, but don't take this as supporting or opposing a candidate for public office. So it doesn't work like that, but it's something that could be there as a possibility for certain types of communications when you assess it as having some kind of a risk and you think it might be helpful to say, no, we're talking about the issue here, not about the election or candidacies. So as I've been alluding to, I talk about things along kind of a traffic light style of assessment here, because like I said, the way this works is it's very subjective, very context driven. So I can give you something like a green light that's low risk, or I can tell you something is a yellow light that there's some degree of risk, and there's a lot of variation in that shade of yellow there. And then finally, a high risk thing. This is something that is actually so far over the line or so close to the line that it just doesn't seem worth the risk for most organizations. So I'll give it a high risk. One thing that people ask me at this point is, what's the what happens? What happens if we cross the line? What happens if we blow through a red light? Well, a few things. Number one is you're certainly exposing your organization to an excise tax, and very likely also to the individual officers and managers of the organization to an excise tax by the IRS. But most importantly, and this is the big fear, is you could conceivably lose your tax exempt status if you blow through the red light on all of this. The IRS, as it turns out, is not the best enforcer of the law here, but if I remember my days in working on clean water advocacy, we have one or two or three or 1,000 folks who would really like to, I'm a bicyclist, so I'll use this analogy, stick in your front wheel and have you go endo over your handlebars. As an organization, they would love to make sure that your organization has to deal with an IRS audit or simply loses its tax exempt status. So complaints fly all over the place that are lodged, often without merit, but they're there. And even though the IRS doesn't enforce very often, the one place where they do enforce it is when complaints come in. So that's why I really want to make sure that you understand these rules and that you're aware of them. And maybe you're going to be going through some yellow lights because you'll determine, hey, no, this communication is worth the degree of risk here. But I also want you to make sure that you're not blowing through red lights, because I remember the folks that were trying to make my organization go away. And you know what? They were real ready to make IRS complaints. Okay, so let's go through some examples here. And I'm using some conservation organizations, some clean water organizations here as examples. I'm using Twitter as my base for all of this. But of course, this applies to all communications, whether they're verbal, written, online, offline, etc. Conservation Lands Foundation, I've been working with them recently. They put out a tweet in January. Senators Ron Wyden and Senator Jeff Merkley have introduced legislation to make permanent the Oahe region of Oregon. One special attraction in this high desert, the 750-mile Oregon Desert Trail. Read more in That Oregon Life. Okay, so this came out in January of 2020. Does this look like it's supporting or opposing candidates? No, not at all. Specifically at that time, we're nowhere near an election. Nothing is going on. It's talking about legislation because it's making permanent that region of Oregon, and that's a beautiful area. If you haven't been there, the beautiful high desert of Eastern Oregon. So this is policy driven. It's driven by legislation. This is definitely a green light. This tweet in January was absolutely super, super green. But I want to show you how a tweet or a communication at one time can actually have a different assessment in the facts and circumstances analysis when all you do is change the time. Let's fast forward. Let's pretend this came out in October of 2020. There's two things in here, or there's two people in here that are mentioned, Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley. Well, guess what? Senator Wyden, not up for re-election this year. Senator Wyden won, I think last cycle ago or 2 cycles ago, perhaps, but he's not up for re-election. Senator Merkley, however, is. And Senator Merkley is in October of 2020. I don't know what the status of that race is, but I know he's going to be running for re-election. So when we praise an incumbent really, 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 really close to an election, that adds some element of risk. Whereas before, back in January, we had none. It's not saying you can't do this, but it's saying you have an increased element of risk here because it could be perceived by the IRS and by the regulators involved that you might be going across the line here, that you're doing this to influence the election. I think it's really unlikely that that would be the case, though, but I still give it a yellow light. Do you want to make this just a green light? Well, just talk about Senator Wyden. Remove the reference to Senator Merkley, and then you're in an okay space. Or remove them both and just talk about the legislation itself. And then and the issues itself, that gets you down to a green light. So a little bit of careful wordsmithing can make something that goes from a green to a yellow back to a green again. So consider that when you do your analysis for all of this. Let's take a look at another one. This is, of course, Clean Water Action, and my box is blocking. This always happens when I do use Zoom because I have boxes that block what I have to read for you. Now more than ever, EPA Administrator Wheeler should keep communities healthy. Instead, he's fast-tracking another attack on safeguards so industry can keep polluting our waterways. Future generations cannot afford any more reckless rollbacks. Hashtag people over polluters. So what do we have here? Are we even mentioning any candidate for office? Absolutely not. We're talking about the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, a non-elected position. So we're talking about policy. We're not talking about elections. We're far away from an election. This actually came out relatively recently. That's a green light. Whoops. Now I got to make sure that I'm clicking on. There we go. When I move the box, I have to move my cursor back. Green light. No problem right there. administrative actor, policy driven, no problem. Let's go to the next one. This is a retweet of a Waterkeeper Alliance tweet. So Waterkeeper Alliance said, EPA issued a sweeping discretionary suspension of its enforcement of environmental laws, which suggests the agency will hold polluters legally responsible for vital environmental requirements, such as monitoring and limiting discharges of pollution to water and air. This came out at the end of March. It does not mention any candidate for office. It is talking about the EPA's policy role, talking about the suspension of the enforcement of environmental laws, all policy driven. That's a green light. But I also want to highlight one thing for you here. Green light for sure. When you retweet another organization's communication, or when you rebroadcast it, or when you do anything that repeats it, that is what we call in the law as incorporating by reference. It's as if everything that was said by Waterkeeper Alliance is said by River Network. So River Network takes on the legal burden of this tweet also by retweeting it. So it's a green light for Waterkeeper Alliance. It's a green light for River Network as well. But I want to highlight that because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, you got to be really careful about what you're retweeting, what you're linking to, what you're friending, you're following, etc. So just keep that in mind. This happens to be a green light. Let's talk about something that National Parks Conservation Association put out back last September. I think I've done some work with them. They're a really great organization doing great work for national parks. You'll note this video, if you want to go back into their Twitter feed and check this out all out, it was really heartbreaking. It was a video where they were uprooting cacti in an area along where the administration was building a border wall. Which you might have heard of in the news before, you know, all of this other stuff became higher profile news. So this is a great example of something that way back then was absolutely a green light. This was a policy issue that NPCA was talking about. They're like, you know what, Oregon Pipe Cactus National Park should not have these cacti removed for a border wall. And this is fine. Why? Doesn't talk about candidates. It doesn't talk about anything except for the issue. I circled this, however, though, because remember we talked about big ticket issues, big high profile issues. The closer we get to the election, something like even mentioning border wall may be considered by the IRS as a proxy for something having to do with the election or re-election of the president. That is a very high profile issue for him, and this is something where people fall on either side very quickly. So it may be that the way that they worded this back in September may be reworded closer to an election, to the extent that this is still an issue, because phrases like border wall, things like that, immigration, stuff like that, that will become more problematic as we get closer to an election for a 501c3, because it's too easy for an issue of that high profile to not be construed as supporting or opposing candidates. Again, intent is not a factor, but this is the type of thing it's a little too spicy, for lack of a better word of saying it, for a 501c3 to use before an election or really close to an election. Far away, not such a big deal. This is very clearly policy driven in nature, but the words do matter. And the closer to an election, this could become at least a yellow light just by using that phrase border wall. Let me do some real easy red lights here for you. I'm just going to fill in red light for you. If you're putting anything that is mimicking campaign slogans, like the one on the bottom, if you're doing anything where you're really clearly opposing a candidate for office, this is the type of thing, whether it's explicit or it's implicit and really, really obvious, that's going to be a red light every single time. You want to avoid getting involved in anything along these lines. And usually for most 501c3s, I don't have to tell you this. You already know this kind of stuff. This is the easy stuff to avoid. But you want to be careful also of making sure that you're not getting involved in coalitions or other things where this kind of stuff can get involved. Of course, it doesn't have to happen at the presidential level. This applies all the way down to the state and local level as well. All candidates, if they're elected, these rules apply. So don't red light yourself with this kind of stuff. I talked about this before, but it bears mentioning. Anytime you are retweeting, liking, or linking to something, it's considered a communication that's incorporated by reference in your communication. So you'll want to make sure you know what you're retweeting, liking, or linking to. If you just link, for instance, to a web page that has a lot of dynamic content change, and it happens to be a non-501c3 organization, that's a bit of a caution flag for me as an attorney. Why? Because maybe when you link to it, it might be just putting up something about policy. But remember that C4 organizations, for example, can do things that are partisan in nature. And maybe that page, if it's a C4 that you're linking to, will change their front page into a really obvious thing that supports or opposes candidates. And you're constantly maybe linking to that thing from your page or in some way, shape, or form. That could be problematic for you down the line. So be mindful of who you're liking, retweeting, linking to, because if that content changes, you're still linking to it, that could create some problems. Now, is this always an issue? Is that if you link to something months ago and that content ends up changing, and especially if it wasn't like a homepage, or if you're linking just to a homepage, that tends not to be an issue. It's if you're linking to something that's a little bit deeper there, if you're linking to a policy page and just their main policy page, and the policy page of that organization changes from legislative in nature to electoral in nature, that's where things can be problematic. So just be mindful, be smart about how you're linking to things. When it comes to retweets and likes, it can be a little bit more sure that when you retweet something, well, that tweet's not going to just change on you. So just be mindful of what that retweet is, because again, the communication is incorporated by reference into your communication. So you got to make sure that it's C3 friendly. Following and friending, it gets a little trickier here because this is a little broader. I mean, it doesn't mean if you were following or friending necessarily an organization that in and of itself could be construed as supporting or opposing a candidate, unless the organization really all it does or primarily does is things that support or oppose candidates. So if you're following and friending a non-C3 organization that really, for the most part, just does non-electoral advocacy, you're almost assuredly going to be okay. I say probably, but I'd say you're pretty assuredly in the green light territory. But if you're following an organization that's purely partisan, a 527, a PAC of any kind, a political party, a candidate committee, that's probably not going to be okay, because what they do are things that only support or oppose candidates. So following or friending them is kind of like a tacit endorsement of that organization. So official accounts versus candidate accounts are something to bear in mind with all of this, because often when we're talking about incumbents here, there's an office holder, they wear two hats, an office holder and then as a candidate running for re-election perhaps. So it's okay to follow an official account. Why? That person is an office holder doing policy work, and if you're engaged with that particular elected official on policy matters, it's not a problem. It makes sense actually for you to do that. What's not so good and what's potentially very risky is to follow a candidate account. Let me use an example from a recent presidential candidate in the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Warren. This is Elizabeth Warren's official campaign account. I have not checked it recently, but of course she's stopped running for US president. This is the type of account that you as a 501c3 should not follow. Why? Because this was dedicated entirely to partisan electoral work on her behalf, which is perfectly fine for her to do, not okay for you to do as a C3. Let's contrast that with the other account that she has, which is her official Senate account. Her official Senate account is her talking about policies and laws and lawmaking and Senate nominations, things that you can be behind and you can work with her on. So this you can follow, you can friend, the other one you can't. Often I get questions about folks who are legislative officials or elected officials who use just one account for both. It's on them. That's okay for them to do. I don't think it's generally a problem to follow that type of a thing, so long as you're doing it for this type of work, the official work, the legislative work, the governing work. If you're following it because of the electoral stuff, that's not a good follow. That's not a good situation. Be mindful if you are going to follow or friend an account like that if you're going to be doing any retweets, you're going to do any likes or whatever, make sure it's only on policy related issues, not on anything that would be considered partisan electoral in nature regarding elections. Okay, let's talk a little bit about candidate education here. Candidate education, Kate talked about this at the top. You're allowed to educate candidates and parties on your issues. You got to offer the information to all viable candidates. Does that mean you've got to give it to everyone? Everyone who's got a reasonable chance based on a good, rational, nonpartisan assessment of winning. There's always an asterisk percenter in almost every single election. You are allowed to maybe not get involved with those folks if there's really truly no partisan reason why you're excluding them, just from a viability perspective. You don't want to create original information for any candidate, particularly upon their request. You could run into issues with tax law and then election law with that, because it might be considered a contribution under election laws, depending on which ones apply, federal or state. You don't want to republish anything in reverse. This is a one-way information flow. You don't want to take anything from a candidate or a campaign and republish it yourself, because that, again, could run afoul of tax law and also election law. But that one-way information flow is really, really good and really important. Before I get into transition team advocacy, a lot of folks will say, so what happens if they end up taking our advice and then championing us on the election stump? And they're like, hey, Columbia Riverkeeper really changed my mind on protecting the watersheds of the Columbia River watershed. So yeah, I'm going to adopt all of their policies. That's great. This is what I tell you to do if you're with Columbia Riverkeeper. Go into the office, go to the refrigerator, rummage through there. In the back, maybe there's a bottle of champagne, maybe. Make something good. Pull that out, pop the cork, enjoy with the office, and then close the refrigerator door and don't put out a press release. Don't champion the fact that the candidate has agreed with you. Why? Because then that communication that you do could look like a tacit endorsement. Just take it and run. Take the fact that they are agreeing with you on these positions, and hopefully they win, because if they win, we get into this next thing, and that's transition team advocacy. After the election, it's okay to re-engage. You're allowed to educate transition teams on issues important to your organization. Hopefully that candidate that you educated while they were running won, and you get to have even more input, like recommending transition team members, recommending people for key positions. If it's an executive branch official, they may have a cabinet. Folks that are going to be appointed to that cabinet have some input in all of that. That's all perfectly fine. We're past the election. You are no longer doing anything that supports or opposes this person as a candidate. You're doing it in a policy-related sense. So transition team advocacy is super important. It's good to think about this now, believe it or not. We don't know who's going to win, but you know what? Have some measures in place for maybe if either side wins in a particular office that you're looking at. Be mindful that this might also be lobbying activity, because some issue advocacy at this stage may count as lobbying, but there are also maybe some advocacy that falls under exceptions if you present it properly. That's outside the scope of this discussion today, but I'll have you take a look at Being a Player, which is our lobbying guide that you can download for free, and I'll tell you how to do that at the end of all of this. Next up, hugely important. I cannot emphasize enough how much voter registration and get out the vote activity is important to do now. We saw what is happening with the overlay of the coronavirus on elections. If you paid any attention to what was going on in Wisconsin, we saw that there were folks that were quite literally forced to go to the polls in order to be able to vote. So there's a whole lot of things that you can do in a nonpartisan way to ensure that we don't end up in kind of a dangerous situation like that. We don't know if this thing's going to be happening again in November, where we're going to have a dip and a resurgence, but if it was anything like the 1918 influenza pandemic, there was a big resurgence right around our election season in 2020. So voter registration and get out the vote, and making sure people know how to get vote by mail if it's available to them, how they can get absentee ballots, all of those types of things. You can do that as a C3. That is pure nonpartisan work and nature. Making sure your members are registered to vote, really, really important. A little bit of language lesson here in case this is relatively new. Voter registration and listing unregistered voters. GOTV, we call it sometimes, get out the vote. Anything that gets people to the polls or to return a vote by mail ballot. Keep in mind with all of this, you have one permissible goal, and that's that you can only do this to encourage people to exercise their right to vote. You can't do it to get them to vote for anybody in particular, for a party in particular, nothing along those lines. You can for a ballot measure, but not for parties or candidates. Targeting your messages. You're allowed to target activities if they're based on nonpartisan criteria. And so there's a few things that are helpful in this area. One is you can do it by location. You don't have to act outside of your regional area. If you work in one particular watershed, well, you can just focus on your voter reg and GOTV within that watershed. That's perfectly fine. Audience, you can do that so long as you don't do it based on the way a group votes. But you can do it if they're a disadvantaged or underrepresented group, or if the targeted group has a common interest or problem. A common interest can be your members, for instance. A common problem could be targeting the homeless population within your community. That's fine. Underrepresented group, disadvantaged, and has a common interest or problem. That kind of checks all of the boxes there. You're allowed to do it in that way. You cannot do it because you think that they're going to vote for a particular candidate. You cannot do it because you think that they're going to vote on certain issues a certain way. And that's the one kind of like area that's a little frustrating for 501c3s. Let me use an example here. You want to talk about a broad range of issues typically here, because the IRS considers it that if you do one issue as opposed to a broad range, that's too easy to show as a pivot point between candidates. So a broad range of issues is generally important. In the clean water realm, we actually have a lot of issues around that. It's not just clean water as an issue. There's issues regarding to zoning, with toxicity levels, with testing, with development, all sorts of things. Those are a variety of issues, all just talking about clean water within your watershed. And I just came up with that off the top of my head. You don't want to suggest a correct position. You got to leave that for the 501c4s out there. Let me use some examples here. Vote green, register here. The IRS has specifically said this is no good. Why? Because you're targeting a particular type of voter. And also, by the way, with the Green Party as a potential party in a lot of jurisdictions, that's another issue right there. It makes it seem like you're saying vote for the Green Party. You can have an impact on the decisions affecting your life. Register to vote now. That's a green light. That's perfectly okay. It doesn't get into issues. It's broad-based, very League of Women Voters style communications. They're the gold standard for all of this. I always point to them as the good examples here. Let's end fracking in our community. Register to vote here. You're looking to register people who agree with you on fracking. While that may be, the issue is noble, we want to end fracking in our community, but you can't pair that with a voter registration effort, because what you're doing is you're getting very particular types of voters. That's considered not okay in terms of your targeting under IRS rules. Other examples. This is a great one. This isn't a conservation organization, but it's one of my favorite examples recently. I don't know what the future may hold, but I know who holds the future by Cleveland Votes. Absolutely a green light. Bunch of other examples. Exercise your right to vote. Hey, that's fine, except it's using the image of the logo of the Democratic Party. That's a no-go. Vote public lands and waters. That one, I'm going to give a yellow light, because in certain contexts, I think you might be okay. Some people say, what's the distinction between vote green, register to vote here, and this? This is a generalized message, as opposed to, hey, folks who agree with us on this issue, come here and we will help you register to vote. Very big distinction there. That's the difference between a red light and might be okay, might not be okay, depends on the other context. Remember, facts and circumstances, it depends. Last but not least, your vote counts. Green light, pure green light. Another one here, take action. Make sure your voter registration is up to date for the March 17th primary or the November 2020 general. Click on either of these to check and update your voter registration. This is the kind of stuff that is 501c3 gold. It's the type of thing that you can do. If you only do one thing with the folks that are on your mailing list, with your supporters, with your members, whatever you call these folks that are in your circle, remind them, pester them, maybe even to the point of annoyance. Hey, are you registered at your current address? If you want to vote by mail and it's illegally available for you, have you signed up for it? These are the types of things that you're going to want to hammer home with every single communication you have from now right on up to the election. Super, super critically important. Voter protection. This goes hand in hand. I've only got one slide on this, because if you're getting involved with voter protection, this is a 501c3 okay activity. Why? It's because what it's doing is it's trying to make sure that there's no disenfranchisement of anyone, regardless of party, regardless of who they are, regardless of where they're at. There is a coalition that exists. It's at 866ourvote.org. If you've got the capacity to lend a little bit of a hand to this, if only to pass along information from the C3 approved activity to your members, to folks in your community, hey, go and do it. Get in touch with them. This is the coalition that you want to be working with. You can see a bunch of national partners here. I went to a recent conference back in January on all of this. They're doing incredible work. They're very organized. You don't have to reinvent the wheel by camping out and helping folks at your local polling place. These folks are absolutely helping out with all of this. So get involved with this if it is something in your wheelhouse. If you want to go beyond just, hey, folks in our wheelhouse, hey, folks in our membership list, hey, folks who support us, make sure you're registered to vote, get involved in the voter protection stuff. Voter education. This comes in two flavors. The first one is voter guides. And we talked about this at the top of the show here. Voter guides, you do have to be really mindful here, because there's an easy way to fall into a trap. League of Women Voters, again, the gold standard for here. You want to talk about a broad range of issues. That means you want to have at least 3, 4, 5 different areas, different question categories to talk about. Why? Because the IRS, as I said before, it's too easy to make any candidate look good or bad relative to your organization's point of view on a single issue. So 3, 4, 5 different areas. How broad? The answer to question number 1 should not suggest the answers to questions number 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's how you want to show that separation there. Make sure the questions are unbiased. If it's an incumbent, say, isn't it true that your vote on Senate Bill 444 actually destroyed the environment? That's a biased question in this context. Don't ask questions like that. What is your position on is a good one. These are examples here on the right side of the screen that League of Women Voters in Columbus, Ohio did. Classic examples. How will you address the opioid epidemic in Ohio? What motivates you to run for office? Unbiased. Don't ask for pledges. This is really, honestly, if there's one thing the IRS is looking for C3s, it's looking for C3s saying, hey, candidate X, do you pledge to only support clean water if you're elected? If you do that, that is very, very likely to catch the attention of the IRS. And certainly folks that are running against you, because this is the one rule that I will give a definitive red blinking light on. You do not want to do candidate pledges. The IRS is explicit on this. It is prohibited. It is over the line. Don't do it. You want to make sure when you do these candidate questionnaires that you give them out to all of the viable candidates. That same viability rule applies, as I mentioned before. Then you put this out into a voter guide. You can present candidate responses in whatever way you want, so long as it doesn't look like you're putting your thumb on the scale. You want it to be an equal format. You can notice here the two different, this was a primary here, which is why they're both Democrats. Relatively equal looking pictures. These were probably the candidate pictures from their websites. Similar format. Don't edit the responses. Set a word limit if you need to. Way back in the day, I also worked for another organization in Oregon called XPAC. You can tell I'm a graying Gen Xer, right? We did these types of things. And one thing that I made sure we did was to make darn sure that the candidates had a word limit, because I can tell you right now, you don't set a word limit, you're going to have one candidate give you a 16 paragraph answer and one candidate that might give you a 1 paragraph answer. And that will look biased in a way, even if you don't intend to. Remember, intent is not an issue here. Candidate debates. This also gets into the candidate forums that Kate talked about at the top here. You want to make sure that you're inviting all of the viable candidates. You want to have fair rules. Now, this is a scenario here with the style that I'm going to talk about is a safe harbor. It's a little different than what she was talking about. That's one where you're sort of like presenting people for public questions. This is one where you're sort of creating some structure. It's the more classic League of Women Voters style debate. You want to have fair rules, an impartial moderator, a member of the media, somebody from the local college. I thought that was a great example there. Unbiased audience, that doesn't mean, I mean, you're not going to be able to say, hey, everybody sit on your hands. What that means is you can't give 75% of the tickets to one candidate and 25% to the other. Either open it up fully to the public or do even a distribution of tickets. Equal opportunity, equal amount of timing, no contextual favoritism. In the forum context, when they come out one at a time, as opposed to a debate when they're all on stage, you want to make sure that the time slot available for the candidates are relatively equal. You don't want to have, you know, maybe your meeting, say, and have one candidate come in at the top of the meeting, then do all of your business, and then at the very end of the meeting, oh yeah, here comes the other candidate. I know it's 2 in the morning, but stick around for it. That's contextual favoritism. You don't want to do that. Questions, again, broad range of issues, unbiased, same as in the voter guides. Last but not least, after I've gone through all of these things that you can do, and this is a lot, nobody in this in any of the organizations that you're representing, working with, are going to probably be able to do all of these things. Pick and choose what works for you. But I will say, I know, having worked in the clean water world before in advocacy, when it was at the end of the day, I would often go home and want to be working on the candidates and for the parties of my choice. And this is a really important thing. What I've been talking about all along here are the rules that apply to 501c3 organizations and their staff and their volunteers. Those rules do not apply to you as individuals. If you, after your day of working, still have the energy and you want to go support the candidate of your choice, you can absolutely do that. There's still a First Amendment. Last time I checked, you're allowed to do things that support or oppose candidates so long as it's on your own time and doesn't use the resources of your C3. So what does that look and feel like? Well, you don't want to use organization resources like working on the clock. Don't do that. Don't send things from your organization, your C3 organization's email. Don't use the copier to copy 400 campaign flyers for the candidate of your choice. You're using resources. The C3 would be paying money to support a candidate at that point, and that is across the line. Across the line, can't do it. So don't use organizational resources. You want to make sure you distinguish yourself as an organizational representative and yourself as an individual. And this is going to be more of an issue if you walk in a room and people are like, oh, Clean Water Organization just walked in the room. Now, I don't have that. When I walk in a room, people don't go, oh, that's the Tim Mooney from Alliance for Justice. No. That's not a problem I tend to have. But I would say that our organization's president, Nan Aaron, she's really active. She's on media. She's on TV a fair amount of the time, working on some high profile stuff around judges, which is what the other side of the office does. She sometimes, if she ever does something like this, she may have to say, oh yeah, I am president of the Alliance for Justice, but I'm here on my own time. She's using a disclaimer. So sometimes what you'll see is you'll see that in written materials. So let's say that you're on your own time, in your own personal capacity, on a fundraising committee for a candidate of your choice. And there's a fundraiser and there's an event and your name is listed on the fundraising committee in a brochure or something that comes in, maybe one of those fancy ones, right? And on that, it may say your name, comma, your organization, the C3. Oh no, wait, the C3 is named in a partisan thing, but then there's an asterisk and that says organization name for identification purposes only. For folks that really need to show that separation explicitly, that's been deemed okay by the IRS. And the other area, this is sort of what I was alluding to before, let's say you're at a house party and maybe you're really well known in your community as working on clean water issues for a C3 organization, but you're there to support a state Senate candidacy of a friend of yours, somebody who you really trust, who you really support, who you really want to win. So you get in there and you walk in there and you're giving a little, everybody's going around talking about their support, they're asking questions. Maybe you're about to ask a question and you say, hey, I know everybody knows that I'm with a C3 organization, but I'm not here representing them right now. I'm here in my capacity as a private citizen. That might be appropriate. That might be what you need to do. Or if you're like me, you don't ever have to worry about it because frankly, nobody confuses me with a C3 at any given time, ever. So whatever works for you, whatever is important, follow those types of criteria. Last but not least, and this is where I get to put up my wonderful hats. The most wonderful hats in the world come from Derby Day in the UK. Google that, it's amazing. Look at these hats. Remember what hat you have on when. I have a C3 hat. Sometimes I take that off and put on a C4 hat because sometimes I work for Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. Sometimes I'm supporting a candidate of my choice on my own personal time. So I have 3 hats. Maybe I have more. Remember what hat you're wearing because the hat's going to determine what you can do and not do. Last but not least, if you're with an organization that's a 501c3, you are allowed to give organizationally staff time off for election day, or in fact, for longer than that. I've heard of some 501c3s in the conservation movement, one in particular that comes to mind, that's potentially giving off a whole week around election day, around election season, because with vote by mail and things like that, election day isn't really a day anymore. There's kind of a lot more of a lead up. A C3 is allowed to give staff time off to vote on election day for just a narrow bit or for the whole day or whatever. And if all they do is say that, then, well, I'll get to that in a moment. If the C3 wants to give staff time off to engage in nonpartisan activities around elections, nonpartisan get out the vote, acting as voting officials at polls, things along those lines, that's fine. If the C3 is saying, hey, I'm giving you all time off to work on nonpartisan things, that's okay. But the second you start saying something beyond, I'm giving you staff time off, it absolutely has to comply with C3 types of things. C3s can't say, we're giving you all the next 2 weeks off, wink, wink, to do whatever you would like to do on for civic engagement. That might be going a little bit too far. The IRS doesn't give us real good guidelines on this, but from my perspective as talking it out with some of these organizations that are talking about doing this, if you go beyond just giving the days off, you have to stay within C3 limits. I don't think that you can put any guardrails up at all unless it guardrails people into C3 activity. But if you just give off time, you say day off on election day, period. Staff, the rules that I talked about on the last couple of slides apply. Staff can use that personal time off to engage in partisan activities. Staff are allowed to take their own personal vacation days off and work on partisan activities should they want. The key here is the 501c3 cannot in any way, in a nudge, a nod, or a wink, say, hey, wouldn't it be great if you went and worked on that campaign? Even implicitly, that would be problematic. But if the individuals with the organization do it on their own time, it's fine. So see the distinction here. The C3 is allowed to give time off. It can do that. But if it goes any further than that, we run into a situation where it's got to put up guardrails for it to be only C3 activity, and they're going to be responsible for those individuals going out doing only C3 activity. So it's easier, frankly, better, easier, etc., to say day off on election day and just leave it at that, if you're interested in doing such a thing. So I throw that out there as a possibility for organizations as well. We probably have 1,000 questions, and I think that we've got a fair amount of time for questions, to take questions from you all. And I just wanted, before I started to delve into the chat box here, to remind you, this is not the end of our relationship. I'm based out of the DC office typically. I am here in wonderful wild West Virginia while all of this goes on, but I am on call occasionally, but every single day an attorney in one of our offices is on call. If you've got questions around election-related advocacy that we covered today, lobbying, which I touched on a teeny tiny bit, anything having to do with advocacy as an organization and the rules around it, we can't be your attorneys on this, but what we can do is help guide you through and understand what the rules are to help you through that analysis so that you understand it a little bit better. I've alluded to before that we have a ton of resources. Go to boulderadvocacy.org. We have incredible resources that are available for free for you. Publications on ballot measures, on election-related activity, on lobbying, and a whole lot more. Fact sheets on some really nitty-gritty areas of the law. If you're thinking about forming a 501c4 organization, we've got stuff on that too. So take a look at all of that. And you can follow us on Twitter, and my work Twitter account is at AFJTim if you'd like to follow along on me on C3 friendly things. You can definitely follow that one. Don't follow my jokes and garbage account, which is one I won't share. That's basically it. How do we want to do questions?
So I think there were a couple questions that popped into the chat. One, if a candidate takes on your talking points, like Kate mentioned, do you have to tone down your talking points, or are you okay if you can show history? So here's what I would say. You continue talking about the issues the same way that you did before. The line I don't want you to cross, and this was the whole thing when I got into the jokey part about popping the champagne, what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, hey, everybody, candidate X agrees with us on this issue. Wow, look at this. We're going to put out a press release because they just said, hey, Clean Water Organization of Appalachia just said our ideas on policy are exactly what that candidate's going to do if elected. That's the kind of stuff you don't want to do because it looks like a tacit endorsement of that candidate. That's why I say, great, pop the champagne corks. You did good. You got a candidate who's got a chance at winning elective office to say, if I win, I'm gonna adopt all of these issues. That's great. You've won. Do your victory lap internal. Don't do an external communication on that. Continue to talk about your issues in the same way that you've done. Just don't link those things together. The candidate can link it. You can't. And that distinction is a little weird, but remember, it's your communications that are going to be looked at, not others' communications. They can't, a candidate or another organization or another entity or another person can't say or do anything that will cause you to lose your status, but you can if you talk about things. So while context matters, it's your communications that matter more in that way. And I hope that distinction is clear. Mm-hmm. Someone also asked, with regards to candidate forums, how does that work during primaries? If you host a forum with all the candidates from one party, is that considered nonpartisan? Does it depend on the circumstance?
So primary elections are considered the exact, a distinct election from the general election, and indeed special elections as well. So the same rules apply in terms of proximity to the election, things along those lines. Now, you were talking about a forum. Same rules would apply. You can't show favoritism. We use that League of Women Voters example that I had a few slides back. Those were two Democrats that were vying for the Democratic Party for that particular office. I think it was a state senate. I can't even remember what it was. It doesn't matter. You can't show favoritism. You can't show support or opposition for anybody, even in the primary context. It doesn't matter. So same rules apply in the forum that you do, a debate if you choose to do it that way. Same rules apply, equal opportunity to answer, non-biased questions, let them come up and talk. Let's say that, so you could do a forum for let's say it's just the Democrats who have a contested primary. This will happen a lot, where let's say you've got one party who's an incumbent who's running unopposed, and then you've got a primary to figure out who's going to run against them. You can just focus and do a debate or a forum on that particular primary. It's a distinct election. It's okay. You don't have to pull in the uncontested incumbent and pull them in as well. You can if you'd like, but I think that it's more likely I shouldn't characterize different elections in different ways or different situations in different ways. You can focus on just that primary if you'd like.
Perfect. And then one more question in the chat. What are the guidelines around helping people get to voting polls?
So as long as you're following the same rules that I talked about before, your targeting is nonpartisan, your messaging is nonpartisan. If all you're doing is saying, let me use Wisconsin as a recent example. If you follow the news, there was a special election in Wisconsin, and in the city of Milwaukee, if memory serves, there were normally 180 polling locations available. There were only 5 that were open because of the virus situation and because the legislature couldn't get its act together and figure out a change in things that was sort of railroaded in. It was politics, et cetera, et cetera. So just because there was politics involved in all of that doesn't mean that you can't, in a nonpartisan way, say, hey, everybody, this is a confusing time. We're a 501c3. We don't support or oppose candidates, but we want to make sure you all know here in the city of Milwaukee, because we're a clean water Milwaukee, that these are the 5 polling locations. These are the only ones that are open. If you live here, if you live in this section of town, you go here. If you live in that section of town, you go there, etc. If you do it in that way, nonpartisan, communicating it out to everybody, don't show favoritism for any particular candidate, party, whatever, that's a perfectly good way to do it. Let me throw another thing out at you. If there are rules and deadlines for applying for an absentee ballot in your jurisdiction, because they vary greatly depending on where you're at, you can make sure the folks that are members or supporters or on your newsletter list or whatever, that they know. You can have links to the Secretary of State's office or whichever entity is controlling it. Could be your county board of elections. You know, click here to check your voter registration. Make sure you're registered where you live right now. Click here to apply for an absentee ballot. So different rules will apply in different states, but giving that information on how to do it is nonpartisan. It's across the board. You're targeting based on your constituency. That's fine. The folks that support your organization, that's common interest, you're totally fine. That's another thing that you can do. And you know, when you think about it, you can have a big impact on making sure lots of people exercise their right to vote. And you can do it within the boundaries of the folks that support your organization, and that's perfectly okay. And I would if there's one thing that you do, like I said, if you run the risk of making the folks that are on your list get sick of you saying it, I would say it's worth it, because if you can make sure that everybody knows that there's nobody left behind, that everybody that follows your work knows how to check if they're registered and how to do an absentee ballot if they want to, or can otherwise check where their polling place is going to be. You've done good if you can do all of that. Getting and activating everybody on your list is a really important thing. So, and that's all nonpartisan, perfectly fine.
And then someone asked if Alliance for Justice still offers guidance to groups, sorting out these context-specific questions, and it sounds like yes, that's the case, Tim.
That is, yeah, we take, in election years, let's just put it this way, we get kind of popular. It's like we feel like the popular nerdy lawyers who practice in this one weird subject matter area. I used to think I was a little nerdy with the Clean Water Act litigation, and then I kind of shifted my practice over to this, super nerdy in a comparison. However, yes, we are here. I've got the screen up here as well. We got folks on I know most folks are kind of more centered around the DC office, but you maybe, if you call or email or use our web form, you may get our folks in Texas or on the West Coast, but we all are equally trained in all of this. And frankly, most of this stuff is federal law, especially for C3s, because the big overarching law is federal tax law. So all of my colleagues are well-versed in this, and maybe you get lucky and catch somebody who's way smarter than this than me, because I've got colleagues who are way smarter than me on this, I can assure you.
Great. So those are all the questions in the chat box. Does anybody on the phone have additional questions that weren't asked in the chat box?
Tim, this is Peter Marks. I have a question. We've had this situation before with the Choose Clean Water Coalition, and probably will at some point again, where we had a conference and we invited the House member. The conference was close to the election, say a month away, and we invited the sitting House member to come and speak, which is something we had done normally. Some people were very concerned with it. We got some legal opinions that were, you know, subjective. But we did that. I think that was fine. I just want to make sure we did it okay. And if the situation comes up again, if we're okay to do that.
Yeah, that's a great example of it depends with my little Magic 8-Ball cartoon. So here's the deal with that. When folks are incumbents, you're allowed to invite them to events as incumbents. And I assume that this was a kind of C3 friendly gathering. It was a policy related type of a thing. Even as we get close to an election, there are still bills that are active in Congress. There's still stuff that's at the regulatory level that's really important. And if this member of Congress is really, really active on the issues and has something to say about the issues, and you're inviting them to talk about, hey, what's going on in Congress right now? This particular Congress is probably wrapping up its time, and what are the successes and what are the failures and what are the things that Congress might be looking at in the next session. That's all perfectly good 501c3 stuff. The one thing that gets a little tricky here is, and I don't think I'm spoiling it for anybody here, but every member of Congress is constantly running for re-election. And the other thing is, not all of them really care all that much about your C3 status as much as you do. So what will sometimes happen is a member of Congress will come and isn't even paying attention to whether you're a C3 or a C4 or a labor union or whatever. Hopefully they would. Hopefully their staff is let them know about this. But sometimes you got to remind folks who are elected officials in your invite in particular, and this is where it's really important, saying, by the way, just a reminder, we're a 501c3 organization. We are prohibited from supporting or opposing your candidacy. We just like, to the greatest extent possible, please don't mention electoral related matters here. We're talking just about policies. You got that in writing, and that's part of your invite. So when the sometimes inevitable thing happens and the member of Congress trips, falls funny, and says, vote for me, give to my campaign, you're far less likely to get in trouble over something like that. So do things to protect yourself in your C3 status, and that can be helpful along the way. I do have to say, in my experience, if they're good enough on your issues and they care about your organization, they're gonna comply and do all of that. But it's always pretty good to have it in writing too. So just those little simple things. And even in the introduction, you could even say, hey, of course, we all know that there's an election coming up, and just a reminder, we're not supporting or opposing candidates for office. That said, here is the chair of the Natural Resources Committee who's going to be giving us a briefing on such and such. That would be fun. That's another good way. Layer up those disclaimers, and that can be very helpful in that type of a situation. And then keep doing it, because that's a really positive policy type of thing that you are doing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right. Oh, does someone have a question?
Need to unmute.
I think you're good.
Corner.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're good.
I just wanted to ask to follow up about the lobbying guide and where we could get that.
Sure, yeah. Right there at the bottom of the screen, you got boulderadvocacy.org. And if you click on our resources tab or link or whatever, I don't even know if I would call it a tab, but click on resources, and then you'll get to a place and you can search for lobbying, or being a player is the name of it. And it is fantastic. It is a guide that was written a long time ago, and it's been over time, it's been updated as the laws require it, but it's really good. It goes into obviously a ton more detail than I was able to get into today. I was only able to touch on the very smallest of things. We do other trainings on lobbying activities, so you can check that out also in our training section on the website, because we do public trainings on this as well.
That would be great. This was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing.
All right, any other questions? You all good?
Thank you, Tim.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was super helpful. This presentation has also been recorded, so we'll be posting it on our website if people need to access it again or would like to share it with anyone. And I definitely encourage folks to reach out to Alliance for Justice if they have any further questions. Like I said, this is the first time the coalition's hosted something like this for our members. So I have a feeling we'll have a lot of people with questions, Tim, and maybe not the last time that we reach out to you as well. And stay tuned for more opportunities to learn about this coming forward. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, Kate Wofford and Mary Rafferty have offered to give a presentation next month on this as well. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, if anyone has any further questions or anything like that, feel free to contact the coalition staff as well. And again, thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time today. It was really great and very informative. So I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity, and good luck, everybody. You do great work. Thanks so much for doing it.
Awesome.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.